Assalamu alaikum. In this lecture, we want to deal with another term that the reader may encounter if he digs into the Hadith literature. And again, it ties into the things we've been talking about in terms of Hadith authentication and showing us how careful our scholars really were in terms of trying to assess Hadiths. And what we'll be talking about today, inshallah, is tadlis. And this word is a noun, or in Arabic a source word, a masdar, from the verb dallasa. And the one who does this action is known as a mudallis. Now, what does this mean? In brief, it's a form of cheating in the chain of narration that is sometimes committed by a narrator, and it's designed to make a chain of narration look better than it actually is. And the scholars have divided this action, this tadlis, into a variety of different subtypes, such as tadlis al-isnad, tadlis al-shiyukh, tadlis al-taswiyah. That is probably a little bit too specialized for us, but let's just give an example. So an example of tadlis can be seen in the following hypothetical chain of narration. Let's say the actual chain of narration is as you see at the top of the slide, that the hadith comes down from the Prophet through F, through E, through D, and C says that D haddathana, and then he tells B, and B says C haddathana, and then he tells it to A. Now, narrator A, instead of giving the full chain, may exclude B and C and say something like, according to D, E said that he heard from F. So he will take out the B and the C narrators, and based on their narration, he will just say an D, that E said, that F said, that the Prophet said. So now this, you can see, is intentionally dropping narrators B and C, and this is known as tadlis at-taswiyah, and it's considered actually the worst form of tadlis. Now, why would narrator A do such a thing? Well, there are a variety of reasons that have been proposed by the scholars. One reason, which is the most sinister, is that narrators B and C are weak. They don't meet the requirements of adl and dhabt, and if they were in the chain, the hadith would be classified as a weak hadith. But the narrator likes the hadith, and so he manipulates the chain to make it look stronger than it actually is. Because if D is strong and E is strong and F is strong in terms of their grading as a narrator, by dropping B and C, or by just dropping B, for example, it doesn't have to be both B and C, this was just an example, and then saying an D, now everybody in the chain looks like they're a strong narrator. However, other reasons may be more benign, such as that narrator A simply wants the chain to be shorter because it's more praiseworthy for him to be closer to the Prophet in the chain of narration. Now, this may sound a little silly to you, but this was a huge deal for hadith scholars, that if they could say that the hadiths they were teaching were from the Prophet in a short chain of narration, that made them much more prestigious as teachers. Now, another proposed reason is that B and C may actually be strong narrators. They may be thiqat, if you remember that term, but they could be younger in age than A, and it was considered unbecoming to narrate from somebody younger than yourself. So remember all of these examples, because inshallah in module 2, one of the things we will be talking about is that hadith scholarship, hadith collection, hadith authentication is a very human endeavor. And so here you can see all of the human motives that come into play when these hadiths are being collected and authenticated. It was not free of the human weaknesses that afflict us in every other area of life. And we will get back to this later, inshallah. Before we go on to another example of tadlis, because this actually is an important issue in the hadith literature, remember when we talked about the distinction between haddathana and an. In our last example of tadlis, we saw how a narrator could drop somebody in the chain and then go to the person after him and say an so-and-so, according to so-and-so. And I told you that that distinction would become important later. Well, it becomes important here in this issue of tadlis. Now, when somebody says an, when it appears in the chain, it doesn't usually indicate tadlis, but it raises this possibility, and the hadith scholars often then go on to further investigation of the chain. So now another example of tadlis is known as tadlis al-shuyukh, disguising the sheikhs. This is a little bit complicated, but again, that's why we've put this stuff in the supplementary section. This is for those of you who want this level of extra detail. So let's say we have two chains, and we're going to focus on narrator E, who narrates hadiths from two narrators. He has two sheikhs. One is F, one is G, and he learns from them. And so you can see the chains of narration, and student E, or narrator E, has learned hadiths from F and from G. Now, before we go further, it's important to note here a well-known habit among the early Arabs, which is that a man is sometimes addressed by a nickname, but it's known more respectably in Arabic as a kunya. And the kunya is sort of a name that he goes by other than his actual name. For example, you all know Abu Bakr, right? We all know him. He is the Prophet's best friend. He is Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. He was the Khalifa. Well, Abu Bakr actually was not his real name. That was his kunya. That is what he went by. He is seldom referred to by his real name, which was Abdullah ibn Uthman ibn Amir. But we all know him as Abu Bakr. So that's what a kunya is, and that's how widespread it is. And sometimes people were known more commonly by their real name. Other times they were known more commonly by their kunya, by their nickname. Now back to our example. Let's say that F is a well-known companion and that G is a successor. He is not a companion. However, G also has a kunya, which is only seldom used, but this kunya is also the same that F is known by, or it's like F's name. So we can denote that as F prime. So now E decides to use this kunya F prime instead of using G in the chain. And so when he narrates from B to C to D to E. That's how the chain appears. E, when he comes to narrate, he knows he's narrating from G, but he tries to disguise that fact by, instead of using G's name, he uses G's kunya, G's nickname, when G isn't really typically known by that nickname, but F is known by that nickname. And so he then confuses the listener into thinking that he actually narrated from the more famous companion F, because that makes the chain of transmission stronger. I hope you were able to follow that, because when the reader hears that the hadith came from F, he will assume that this is the well-known companion F, like for example Abu Bakr, rather than the seldom used kunya F prime of successor G. So in this way, E makes it seem that the hadith is linked directly to the Prophet, when the hadith may actually be coming from a successor The hadith may be a mursal hadith, or he may just make it look stronger. He may fool you into thinking that the chain is complete when it isn't, or that the chain is stronger than it is. And I've put for you in your syllabus a concrete example. I'll just sort of go through it verbally. There's a narrator named Atiyya al-Awfi, and he is equivalent to E above. And he narrates hadiths from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, who was a younger companion of the Prophet, and he would be equivalent to F above, and from Muhammad ibn al-Sa'ib al-Kalbi. And this man is a successor. He's equivalent to G above. However, Muhammad al-Kalbi has a seldom used kunya of Abu Sa'id. And so Muhammad's seldom used kunya is Abu Sa'id. And so it is said, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, I don't want to be impugning this Atiyya al-Awfi, that Atiyya al-Awfi would sometimes use Abu Sa'id to refer to Muhammad ibn al-Sa'ib and to make it seem like he had heard the hadith from the companion Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. Okay, so these things really do exist in the literature. Now, one important takeaway message is that our scholars have exerted a truly monumental effort in trying to authenticate hadiths, and few really appreciate this amazing work and devotion that they gave their lives to, and we really should appreciate what they have done. Now, what happens to the hadith and the narrator in the case of tadlis? Let's say the scholars uncover that a narrator is guilty of tadlis. The opinions among scholars have varied. Many of them have said that a narrator who indulges in tadlis should simply have his hadiths rejected, and he becomes known in the hadith books as a mudallis, and you just don't accept hadiths from him because he's indulging in some sort of deceit regarding the chain of narration. Others have held a more lenient opinion, which is that if the narrator is otherwise known to be pious and precise, then his hadiths can be accepted, but only if the phraseology of his narration is of the form haddathana, he told us directly, unequivocally, or sami'tu an, that I heard from, but his hadiths should be rejected if he uses an. And so once again, you see that distinction between haddathana and an was not just sort of an empty waste of time, that it does have practical significance. So I hope that by going into this level of detail, it opens some doors for perhaps the few of you who are interested in further study. Okay, next lecture, inshallah, we will take on a different supplementary topic. See you then, and God bless. Assalamu alaikum.